Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. My name is Angie Grove. I'm the executive director here, and welcome to our free monthly lecture program. This is a monthly program where we have a variety of guest speakers, always free to the public, though your generous donations are always appreciated as we are a nonprofit, and it is only through donations that we are able to do programs like this. As well as through the generous donation of our sponsor of today's lecture, which is the North Country Federal Credit Union. Thank you to them for helping us put on this program. Now today is a very special day because not only is it our monthly lecture, this whole weekend has also been a reenactment weekend. So our guest lecturer, I think, also has some guests who will be joining her for this event. Now before we get to more about today's lecture and the amazing reenactors that are part of the show and tell, I want to give a couple of announcements for our upcoming other programs, including our next monthly lecture, which will be on Sunday, July 20th. And that is a lecture titled, "Was This Owned by Ethan Allen? A Look at the Objects and Legacy Ethan Allen Left Behind." And the presenter will be Ms. Katie Grant, who's the collections manager at the Vermont Historical Society. So please come for that. That is also our Thomas M. Achenbach Memorial Talk in honor of the late Tom Achenbach, who was a dear friend of the Homestead here and is sponsored by his family and friends. The day prior to that, we have another reenactment on July 19th, a Saturday. That is our Home and Hearth reenactment, where we have reenactors in the house, around the home and the hearth, and reenacting everyday life in the 18th century. So please come for that next reenactment event. But most immediately, tomorrow is a Vermont state holiday called Ethan Allen Day. Yes, someone in the audience has heard of it. That's so great to hear. So Ethan Allen Day is on June 23rd every year. It's been a state holiday since 2016 when the governor declared it. It's on June 23rd because that is the calendar day in 1775 when Ethan Allen, Seth Warner, and the Green Mountain Boys were commended by the United States Continental Congress down in Philadelphia. That was a big deal that really legitimized the Green Mountain Boys and, they hoped, the independence movement for the state of Vermont, although it took quite many more years before Vermont became officially independent to the United States, within the United States. So Ethan Allen Day every year is commemorated here at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum with free admission for Vermonters who want to come and learn about Ethan Allen. So tomorrow, please spread the word to your friends and neighbors. If you're local, Vermonters get into the museum for free and go on our guided tours, our popular costume corner, and all the other parts of our regular programming. Okay. Last up, I just want you to save the date for Fanny's Weekend, August 16th through 17th. We will have a Fanny reenactor here, but we're also partnering with Chittenden County Historical Society, who is organizing many different family-friendly activities in partnership with many of the historical organizations in northwestern Vermont, including the Archaeological Society, Vermont Historical Society, Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association, and more. Everyone will be here for all sorts of fun activities, August 16th through 17th as well. Okay, so that's enough about what's in the future. Let's talk about what's going on right now. So today we have a wonderful speaker named Skye Makaris. I met Skye over 3 years ago when I first started here at the Homestead Museum, and was very heartened to find someone who also had a life's mission to find those women in history who've been overlooked and the roles that women have done in history that have been often overlooked. It is the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum, but Ethan was not the only one who lived here. In fact, it was mostly women and children and doing a lot of the work for the homestead. So Skye Makaris, I've been honored to hire her on here as our lead educator. She also spends a lot of her time as this distaff coordinator for Warner's recreated regiment. And long ago, I know that she took to heart the idea that well-behaved women rarely make history. So now she seeks in her capacity as a living historian to interpret those lives of those forgotten women who quietly kept the world turning. Her hand-sewn historical costumes have won awards from the Society for Creative Anachronism, and her research has been published in outlets around the country and around the world. Skye has lectured here at the museum before on working women's clothing back in September 2022, which you can see on YouTube, and she's delighted to be back, and we're delighted to have her. Today she's going to be speaking about health and hygiene in the Continental Army, and the one fun fact, it's kind of a morbid fact, that I wanted to point out before she gets started is that germs have killed more people in war times, not just in the United States, but around the world, than guns or other weaponry have ever done so. And it is mostly women who have fought the war against those germs. So with that, please welcome Skye Makaris.
All right, so I will do my best to live up to that glowing endorsement. So, good afternoon, and a very happy Ethan Allen weekend to all assembled. My name is Skye Makaris, and as Angie just introduced, I am the lead educator here at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. You may remember me from my September 2022 Sunday lecture on dressing the 18th century working woman. I'm also the distaff coordinator for Warner's Recreated Regiment, a few members of which can be seen throughout the audience right now. Now, the word distaff means pertaining to women, which in practice means that I am in charge of the domestic and non-combat aspects of our regimental portrayal. Now, this weekend, I was up to my elbows in the practical aspects of health and hygiene in the Continental Army, laundering soldiers' dirty breeches from dawn to dusk. Today, I will be discussing the theory behind the practice, what cleanliness is, why it matters, and how it intersects with the health and overall morale of an army on campaign. First, let us define our terms. Specifically, let us draw a distinction between bathing and washing. Bathing, in an 18th century context, refers to full immersion in a tub or body of water. This practice was not as closely associated with cleaning oneself as it is today. Indeed, it was often considered more recreational than strictly necessary to hygiene. Our modern concept of the bathing suit, used for recreational swimming rather than daily ablutions, is an artifact of this cultural distinction. At the time of the American Revolution's outbreak, public opinion was divided on the benefits of full aquatic immersion. Many people believed that water would open the pores to disease. This controversy is subtly but distinctly indicated in the 1777 journal of Lieutenant James M. Hayden, in which he makes reference to, quote, the men of each regiment who are willing to bathe, illustrating that there are some who were, in fact, not willing to bathe. Lieutenant Hayden himself, for the record, went on to state that, quote, the practice should be encouraged as highly beneficial to health. So we know where he stood on that particular controversy. Immersion bathing grew in popularity throughout the 18th century, finally bursting into the mainstream in the 19th century with the rise of water cures and public spas. But that is a story for another lecture. Washing, on the other hand, was ubiquitous. Much like the sponge bath of today, washing took place at basins, with spot scrubbing with linen cloths doing the job of a full immersion bath. While regimental books and other resources for soldiers are light on mentions of bathing, they all resoundingly emphasize the importance of washing. This fact runs somewhat contrary to our modern expectations. Popular imagination situates historical people, particularly soldiers, as inveterately filthy. We've all heard the urban legends. They wore the same clothes every day, were riddled with fleas, and generally stank to high heaven. To hear pop culture and the shallower ends of history tell it, you might think that cleaning oneself was invented sometime around the First World War. While individuals have always varied in their personal habits, and some people probably did indeed stink to high heaven, the surviving literature on the subject is overwhelmingly clear. Cleanliness was next to godliness. To be clean and presentable was to uphold the social contract. To violate this contract was to be found wicked and unprincipled. This social norm, already firmly enforced, was strengthened tenfold in the military, where proper decorum was crucial to maintaining morale. Good hygiene conferred more than just abstract benefits. Though the germ theory of infection had yet to be widely adopted, keen 18th century observers understood the causative effect of poor hygiene on illness. A 1777 pamphlet issued by the Continental Congress to the officers of the Continental Army made this point rather poetically, stating that, quote, "Too much cannot be said in favor of cleanliness. If men grew as speedily and spontaneously as blades of grass on the continent of America, the want of cleanliness would reduce them in 2 or 3 campaigns to a handful of men. It should extend, 1, to the body of a soldier. He should be obliged to wash his hands and face at least once every day, and his whole body 2 or 3 times a week, especially in summer. The cold bath was part of the military discipline of the Roman soldiers and contributed much to preserve their health. 2, it should extend to the clothes of a soldier. Frequent changes of linen are indispensably necessary, and unless a strict regard is paid to this article, all our pains to preserve the health of our soldiers will be to no purpose." And this is from Directions from Preserving the Health of Soldiers, recommended to the consideration of the officers of the Army of the United States, published in 1777 by Dr. Benjamin Rush. The advice of this aforementioned pamphlet was not merely theoretical, but formally adopted throughout the Continental Army. Orderly books, that is, formal records of orders or instructions issued to a particular unit, from dozens of different regiments, list slightly different but otherwise remarkably uniform cleanliness requirements. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, writing in 1779, emphasized that, quote, "men's clothes are whole and put on properly, their hands and faces washed clean, their hair combed, their accoutrements properly fixed, and every article about them in the greatest order." Sergeant Jonathan Burton observed in a 1776 diary entry that, quote, "no soldier in this regiment is to presume to appear on the parade for guard with dirty hands or face." Colonel Anthony Wayne noted on April 13, 1776, that, quote, "the weekly officer will see that the men at roll calling in the morning have their hair tied, hands and face washed, and in every respect appear in a soldierly manner." On August 25th of the same year, Colonel Wayne wrote that, quote, "the 4th Battalion is to be under arms at 3 o'clock this afternoon, well powdered, fresh shaved, and clean linen. All must turn out." The specific elements vary by account, but the themes are consistent. In the 29 letters, diaries, pamphlets, and orderly books I studied, I found 18 explicit directives to comb one's hair, 10 to wash one's hands and face, 10 to bathe one's entire body, 10 to wear clean clothes, 9 to shave, and 3 to clean one's feet. These were not mere suggestions, but military orders backed with the full force of the law. Punishments for disobedience varied, but all were designed to sting. Colonel Wayne wrote in June 1776 that every non-commissioned officer who shall come to the parade dirty, with a long beard, or his breeches knees open, shall be mulcted, or docked, a day's provision for each offense, and do a double tour of duty. Bennett Cuthbertson, in his 1776 System for the Complete Interior Management and Economy of a Battalion of Infantry, proposed that, quote, "if any man, at the inspection made by the non-commissioned officers, is found improperly dressed, he is to be sent immediately to the Black Hole on bread and water for 2 days. Should it so happen that a sergeant or corporal has been negligent or idle enough to pass by or connive at the improper dress of a man belonging to his squad, and suffers him to appear before the officer as fit for duty, he should be imprisoned for the same number of days he ought to have confined the soldier, who for this time should escape the punishment he so well deserved. If a repetition of such omissions appear in the same persons, a court-martial will be necessary." The severest punishment of all was reserved for, arguably, the greatest offense: defecation outside designated areas. An orderly book from Vermont's own Mount Independence records that any non-commissioned officer or soldier who shall commit any nastiness in or about the camp, other than the vaults or necessary houses prepared for the purpose, shall receive 20 lashes on his bare back for every such offense. Now, it is clear from the primary sources and their context that such exhortations are issued not, or at least not merely, to be punitive, but for the good of the privates and the regiments as a whole. The moral nature of these commands was sometimes emphasized. Colonel Wayne wrote that that soldier who neglects to appear as decent as the nature of his situation will admit is unfit for gentlemen's company and a coward. Sergeant Jonathan Burton mused in his diary that if a soldier cannot be induced to take pride in his person, he soon becomes a sloven and indifferent to everything else. Of more significant concern, however, was the health of the men. Contemporary accounts make devastatingly explicit the connection between poor hygiene and poor health. Maurice, Count of Saxony, cautioned in 1759 of failure to change one's stockings. He wrote, "In regard to his feet, they, with stockings and shoes, rot in a manner together, because he has not wherewithal to change them. And though he has, it can be of little signification, because presently afterwards he must be in the same condition again. Thus, as may be naturally supposed, the poor soldier is soon sent to the hospital." Lieutenant General Richard Lambert wrote vividly of men in his company who had neglected to comb their hair for days on end. He wrote that they frequently let the hair remain in one or other of these forms for some days together, giving it occasionally, without opening and combing it, a sort of outward slight dressing, by way of concealing their neglect from their officers, the ill consequence of which is that the man, by not combing his head, the skin contracts in a small space of time not only accumulated humors, which break out into scabs and ulcers, but an accumulated mixture of filth, dirt, and vermin, which proves as pernicious to the man himself as it becomes infectious to others. He was not alone in observing that problems of personal hygiene can rapidly spread throughout a regiment, disabling many men in turn. Captain John Peebles wrote on September 19, 1776, that by the number of sick men that have lately been sent to the hospital and those that daily complain, the commanding officer has great reason to fear that the battalion in a few weeks will be incapable of doing duty. To prevent which disgrace falling upon a corps of grenadiers, it is the major's orders that a non-commissioned officer per company see that the men bath or wash their feet thrice a week. Reading between the lines of this and other accounts, one finds evidence of the uphill battle many commanders were facing. Some men did indeed balk at cleaning themselves. Colonel Wayne complained on July 18, 1776, of the disagreeable necessity of repeating orders with respect to keeping the men clean. 4 days later, he made detailed note of a soap delivery to his camp at Fort Ticonderoga, and specified how it was to be divided among the men. Detailing the precise allotment to each company was clearly necessary, as alluded to in a 1777 orderly book of the Pennsylvania State Regiment of Foot. "No soldier shall on any pretense be permitted to sell his soap, and if detected in doing so, he shall be severely punished. This ample allowance of soap being made, the commanding officers of regiments and corps will be answerable that henceforward their men appear decent and clean." Cuthbertson elaborated further on unsavory habits that many enlisted men brought to the Continental Army, and suggested ways to ameliorate them. "It will contribute very much to the cleanliness of the soldiers," he wrote, "if the commanding officers of companies will order towels to be fixed on rollers behind the door of every barrack room, to prevent them from wiping their hands in the sheets, upon the beds, which otherwise will most certainly be the case. And as a couple of these towels are sufficient for each room, and the expense extremely trifling, it surely must be doing right to abolish so filthy a custom." Now, for a visual aid, we have Corporal Seagartell to show you merely 3 hours worth of soldiering, the effect on one's hands. So you can certainly imagine dozens of men, if not hundreds, who are wiping their hands on their bed sheets every night. So you can see why a specific order perhaps had to be implemented to prevent this. Certainly.
This was for demonstration.
Sure. Yeah, you're good. Thank you. Human habits have varied, however, for as long as there have been human beings. It is clear from other regimental sources that many soldiers were indeed fastidious in their personal ablutions, and some seemed even to enjoy them. When regiments camped in areas with an abundance of fresh water, immersion bathing became so popular that orders were quickly given to establish its specific parameters. A 1777 account from Ackland's Grenadier Battalion Orderly Book emphasizes that the order given out last campaign against soldiers bathing in the middle of the day to be strictly adhered to, and none to be permitted to go into the river between the hours of 10 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. Sir William Howe's 1775 Orderly Book likewise states that the order of yesterday, directing the men to bathe mornings and evenings only, and not to continue long in the water, is not properly attended to. They are altogether to defer this exercise when the tide only admits of it in the heat of the day. Commanders' accounts expressed both moral and physical reservations regarding immersion bathing, perfectly summarized in 2 brief notes from General George Washington himself. In 1775, he complained that his men, after bathing in Boston's Charles River, were running about naked on the bridge whilst ladies of the first fashion in the neighborhood were passing over it. His admonitions had clearly not sunk in 4 years later, in 1779, when he wrote that there is to be no bathing between the hours of 8 and 5, and the custom of remaining long in the water is to be discontinued, as it is too relaxing and injurious to health. It is also expected that soldiers in this kind of recreation will observe more decency than they usually practice. These orders to be read to and impressed upon them by their officers. By now, we have thoroughly established the importance of cleanliness to the Continental Army, as evidenced by its plethora of direct orders and the consequences, both social and legal, for failing to live up to them. How then did they achieve this standard? What did day-to-day hygiene practices actually look like for soldiers in camp or on the march? On this subject, there is an equal abundance of sources, which I and my fellow living historians can supplement with the knowledge of our own experiences. To the maintenance of daily hygiene in the 18th century, there is perhaps nothing more integral than linen. Linen is a textile that derives from the flax plant, which has been cultivated for thousands of years and grows in a variety of climates. And we are, in fact, the only living history museum in New England that grows and processes our own linen from flax. Due to the particular cellular structure of this plant, linen has natural moisture-wicking properties. That is, its molecules are organized around soaking water up and pushing it out. To wear linen close to your skin on a hot day is to have it constantly pulling the moisture away from your body, thus keeping you relatively cool and dry. It also has antimicrobial properties, so bacteria is not building up in your sweaty underarms as you're wearing it. In the 18th century, as for much of human history before it, a linen layer was always worn between the skin and the outer clothing. Unlike today, the vast majority of outer clothing did not touch the skin directly. An 18th century woman, like myself, wore a knee-length linen shift beneath her stays, petticoats, and gown. And you can see it peeking out at my elbows here. An 18th century man wore a long linen shirt that tucked between his legs inside his breeches, serving as shirt and underpants in one. This practice contextualizes the phrase, in one's shirt sleeves. The shirt, due to its direct, intimate relationship with the body, was considered an undergarment and not meant to be seen. To be in one's shirt sleeves in public, that is, to forego a frock coat over your shirt and waistcoat, was to be patently indecent. This linen layer had a double-ended effect, protecting both my clothing from my body and my body from my clothing. Human sweat and sebum, and the bacteria they can generate, degrade fabric. In the Continental Army, where your clothing ration was expected to last all through the hardships of a campaign season, preserving what little one owned was crucial. Frequent laundering likewise degrades fabric. We've all had the trauma of a favorite garment disintegrating in the wash. Due to the linen intermediary absorbing the sweat and grime, however, 18th century clothes were rarely, if ever, washed. Changing the interior linens was enough to keep them in reasonable shape. Protecting your body from your clothing was also of significant import, especially for a soldier on campaign. Contemporary writers spoke rather ominously of the itch. The sores and scabs collected from insect bites, various minor injuries, and sleeping on bare ground. And I think a few of us are really feeling that from the weekend today. For an open wound to rub up against a layer of clean linen, rather than a dirty outer garment, could make the difference between an irritation and a case of sepsis. In a war where far more men died from disease than from enemy bullets, commanders and privates alike were keenly aware of the razor's edge between health and infirmity. As such, 18th century laundry was dull but vitally important work. It is not often written of, but its steady practice, day in and day out, underlaid the entire military project. A soldier on campaign could wash his own clothing, or he could pay between 3 and 5 pence, depending on the garment, to outsource the task. A woman attached to the Continental Army could make a brisk living scrubbing soldiers' unmentionables. She was expected to perform her task diligently and not pout or haggle, as was made explicit in multiple orderly books. It was noted on December 10, 1776, in the orderly book of the 4th Pennsylvania Regiment, that any woman belonging to the regiment who shall refuse to wash for the men shall be immediately drummed out of the regiment, as they are not found in victuals to distress and render the men unfit for duty, but to keep them clean and decent. So we won't feed you if you won't pull your weight. Likewise, the 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment in 1778 listed the appropriate fees for laundering various items of clothing and warned that, quote, should any woman refuse to wash for soldiers at the above rate, he must make complaint to the officer commanding the company to which he belongs, who on finding it proceeds from laziness or any other improper cause, he is immediately to dismiss her from the regiment. If she attempts to remain afterwards, he must have her drummed out, as the colonel is determined that no woman shall draw rations from the continent in his regiment unless they make use of their endeavors to keep the men clean. So, what did these women's jobs actually look like day to day? They were similar in principle to our modern laundering practices, but different in a few notable ways. One significant difference is that 18th century laundresses made a good deal more of their natural resources than we tend to do today. Another is that laundry, to them, was a multi-day process with many distinct steps. I'll be speaking to both these differences today. The 18th century laundry process began with a step called bucking. This is unfamiliar to us today, but it was, in fact, practiced for hundreds of years prior to the advent of modern detergents. Bucking is an overnight lye soak, often done in a copper tub to avoid a chemical reaction of the lye with any other metals. The inclusion of this step speaks to an understanding, albeit a pre-modern one, of the chemical components of cleanliness. To wash something on a chemical level is to loosen its dirt molecules and then flush them away. Nowadays, we rely chiefly on soap to loosen these molecules, but it is far from the only option. An overnight soak in lye, with its highly alkaline nature, will do a significant amount of this work, thus lessening the amount of soap required for the actual wash. This step is deeply necessary in times and places where soap may be scarce or poor quality, such as for soldiers on campaign. Colonel Daniel Broadhead of the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment wrote the following to Lieutenant Colonel Tench Tillman on December 30th, 1777. He wrote, I conceive that if proper persons were appointed to gather the dirty tallow of the beef cattle slaughtered for our army, which at present is carelessly thrown away, and of the ashes which might be collected from the huts, and furnished with large kettles for boiling soft soap, that the non-commissioned officers and privates of the whole army might soon be supplied with a sufficient quantity to wash their linen, and a great quantity of salt which must be used for making hard soap, saved to the United States. Colonel Broadhead here is referring to the process of making lye, distilling hardwood ash in hot water. It's exactly as easy as it sounds. If you have enough wood to light a fire, you will have enough ash to make at least a washload's supply of lye. If you have beef tallow or olive oil to spare, you can combine these fatty substances with lye to make a rudimentary soap, with no need for the salt needed to create actual soap cakes. And, as I've previously mentioned, a lack of spare tallow or oil needn't deter cleanliness. Lye, by itself, will accomplish much of the task even without the saponification process. Today, lye can be made on the stove, either by boiling the ash and water together or by pouring hot water through a strainer filled with ash. I make most of mine this way, pouring hot water through a tightly woven linen cloth. However, a more traditional method, which you may have seen me attempting this weekend right out by the Allen house, involves a leach barrel and a soap-making stone. A barrel with holes drilled in its bottom is filled with layers of ash interspersed with straw and twigs, forming a natural filtration system. Water poured into the barrel soaks into the ash and filters through the straw. The barrel sits atop a stone with a groove carved in its center, through which the lye can sluice into a waiting container below. Once collected, it can be used either in its pure form or boiled with fat to make a rudimentary soft soap, as Colonel Broadhead discussed. Popular wisdom holds that sufficiently alkaline lye, of a pH around 13, will be able to float a fresh egg. That said, I've had plenty of success without verifying in this way. After the bucking stage, the laundry process looks to modern eyes much more like laundry. An 18th century laundress would perform a series of cold rinses, agitating the laundry with each and adding soap if available. Here, chemistry meets physics. The dirt molecules that have been loosened by the lye soak are now separating from the fabric and being rinsed away. Before the Victorian-era introduction of the washing machine, this was accomplished solely through human effort. Laundresses could beat their linens with paddles or bats, or rocks with nothing else available. They could knead the fabric like bread dough, wringing out water and dirt, which is actually my preferred method. They could also, on the hottest days, take off their shoes and stomp on the clothing in mimicry of making wine. The physical intensity of these methods provides another opportunity for linen's unique properties to shine. Flax fibers, being naturally long and flexible, are up to 3 times stronger than shorter fibers like cotton, and grow only more so when wet. Only the strongest and most pliable textiles could stand up to the regular beatings of 18th century laundry without disintegrating. The 19th century's gradual reliance on cotton over linen undergarments would, in fact, have considerable implications for both bodily hygiene and laundry practices. But once again, that is a story for a different lecture. To return to today's subject, recall that I've specified cold rinses. This seems counterintuitive, as the image of the laundress bending over a steaming cauldron is so entrenched in popular imagination. But consider that hot water, by its nature, will set stains, while cold water will help release them. An 18th century laundress cold rinsed her linens until the water ran clear. Only then, when they were sufficiently white and no stains could be set, would she boil them to kill any remaining bacteria. Now, what other substances might she use to keep those whites sparkling? Just as we use various additives and whiteners today to tackle well-set stains, our 18th century counterpart had similar tricks up her metaphorical sleeve. There was plenty that could be done in the absence of a consistent soap supply. In particular, soapwort and fuller's earth, 2 natural substances accessible to keen-eyed foragers, could go a long way. Soapwort is a type of flowering plant that, when boiled, undergoes a process very similar to saponification, producing a foamy white substance that can be skimmed off the cauldron and left to cool, then to be used as a soft soap. Fuller's earth is a type of clay silicate that absorbs grease and oil. It is so named for its use in the fulling, or wool refining trade, in which it was integral to removing lanolin from the processed wool. Laundry texts throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period make explicit mention of fuller's earth, such as a 14th century housekeeping manual that included the following. Have fuller's earth soaked in lye and put it on the stained spot. Let it dry and then rub. If the earth doesn't come off easily, have it moistened in the lye, let it dry again, and rub until it goes away. Or, if you don't have any fuller's earth, have ashes soaked in lye and put those well-moistened ashes on the spot. Though fuller's earth was not discovered in North American soil until the 1890s, its established presence in Britain and the European mainland indicates that it is something with which the average continental soldier might have been familiar and may have had access to via trade networks. Another method to which all armies throughout human history have had ample access goes by the name of chamber lye. No points if you have already worked out this euphemism. Chamber lye is, in fact, stale urine collected from chamber pots and latrines. Though it is significantly more acidic than highly alkaline ash lye, with a pH around 4, it is similarly useful for overnight soaks and particularly for spot treatment of difficult stains. Hannah Woolley instructed in 1677's The Complete Chambermaid to, quote, lay the garment all night in urine, rub all the spots in the urine as if you were washing in water, then lay it in more urine another night and then rub it again, and do so until the stains be quite out. Some reenactors have reportedly attempted this method, but I have not yet been quite so successful at convincing my regiment. Now, despite the prevalence of the clothesline in rural America, a curious image pops up regularly in pre-modern laundry depictions, that of white linens stretched out on open ground to dry. This method, known as grassing, dates back centuries before the American Revolution and has been corroborated by modern scientific methods. Tradition dictated that linens laid out on grass to dry would wind up brighter white than those hung on a line. And studies bear this out. As sunlight bleaches from above, oxygen released by grass bleaches simultaneously from below. In my personal experience, it also smells quite pleasant. This method, of course, was reliant on ample space and clean ground, both of which could be hard to come by for an army on the march. Indeed, most illustrations of camp laundries specifically show textiles hung on lines or draped over shrubs or trees. One imagines that a freshly grass-bleached shirt might have been a rare luxury upon decampment to a more spacious area. Nonetheless, the sun itself was an asset even absent the grass component, being both a bleaching agent and a potent disinfectant. Clean linens, however, were only one part, though indeed an integral one, of campaign hygiene. Laundresses could do only so much. The task eventually fell to each individual man to maintain his personal toilette. The orderly books I perused have in common a strong emphasis on hair care, both scalp and facial. On this subject, modern misconceptions abound. Historian Abby Cox, in her 2021 book, The American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Beauty, addresses a particularly enduring one. One of my favorite myths is that women would leave their hair up in these elaborate hairstyles and rats would live in them. Seriously, rats. Can you imagine having a rodent that weighs between 8 and 12 ounces living on your head? Now imagine Queen Charlotte of England living with rats on her head. It just doesn't make sense. It's so illogical, it's funny. But for some reason, people have perpetuated this myth over and over again. What is true, however, is that 18th century hair was not washed nearly as often as our own. Notably, continental orderly books, in describing enlisted men's hygiene requirements, rarely refer to washing one's hair, making far more frequent mention of combing and powdering. It is easy to assume in the 21st century that these actions are largely cosmetic. In the 18th century, however, they were the principal ways of keeping hair clean and free of vermin. Powder, in this context, must be understood not as a fashionable accessory, but as a sort of dry shampoo, absorbing dirt and grease from the hair much as fuller's earth absorbs it from cloth. Powder was often used in combination with pomade, or pomatum, oil-based creams that coat the hair and provide a conditioning effect. In her book, Cox discusses the results of her own year-long experiment in using pomade and powder in place of shampoo. She writes, "Most people associate pomade and powder exclusively with the aristocratic elite, but these products were available to everyone. This was hair care, as basic and simple as hopping in the shower for us today. Combing your hair was encouraged in 18th century hair care books for a reason. It moves the oils and powder away from the scalp and prevents buildup. On the other hand, brushing your hair is a terrible idea. Brushing makes the powder pile up and look like the worst case of dandruff of all time. It isn't a good look." She continues, "Throughout my experiment, I had to do a fresh pomade and powder at minimum every 2 weeks, but it was best to do it every week. The fresh application of pomade and powder would clean and freshen my hair and make my scalp feel better. A day or so after applying fresh powder, it would start to disappear. While my hair wasn't as dark or glossy as it would be when freshly washed with shampoo and conditioner, it also didn't have that stereotypical powdered look. The powder would be absorbed, but I would still have the pliability and volume that I wanted, while my hair was more natural in color. I never got lice, fleas, rats, bugs, unicorns, narwhals, boogeymen, or unwanted vermin in my hair. I would find bits of thread and fuzz, though. I never got an infection, nor did I lose my hair. It was healthy and happy as long as I combed it. And you can check out her 20-minute YouTube video on the topic, which is a very interesting watch. Together, end quote. Together, powder and pomade behaved much like the shampoo and conditioner of today, even without the addition of water. The one absorbed grease and dirt, while the other coated each strand in protective, nourishing oils. Some pomades, depending on their specific ingredients, were even protective against lice and fleas. Historian Lauren Stowell writes that, quote, Historian Lauren Stowell writes that, pomade will not attract lice, bugs, rats, or other vermin because of the scents used to prepare it. Clove oil, regularly featured in pomade recipes, is a natural pest deterrent, as is citrus oil. Both are often found in modern-day natural flea and tick repellents for your pets. Wearing pomade and powder will not cause you to get lice. While lice don't care if your hair is dirty or clean, they have a difficult time adhering to the hair strand if there is pomade and powder on it. So, wearing pomade and powder might actually prevent you from getting lice. Combing, as well, was integral to this process, for far more than just the detangling we rely on it for today. In the absence of a good shampoo scrub, the teeth of the comb performed a similar function to our fingertips in the shower, disrupting bacterial colonies and loosening dirt molecules. Combs also distributed natural oils evenly throughout the hair, preventing them from building up on the scalp and festering. This was necessary not just for personal comfort, but for preventing sores that might develop into more systemic infections. Recall from a few slides back Lieutenant General Richard Lambert's vivid description of, quote, accumulated humors which break out into scabs and ulcers, and an accumulated mixture of filth, dirt, and vermin which proves as pernicious to the man himself as it becomes infectious to others. Now, it is important to note that most of our primary sources for 18th century hair care concern civilians with reasonably stable lives and few supply chain issues. Indeed, there is ample evidence that, although Continental soldiers were held to the hygiene and appearance standards of peacetime, they were often unable to reach them. Many orderly books make reference to the instructions within being followed when able. A particularly illuminating juxtaposition comes from the previously mentioned Cox and Stowell work and the 1778 orderly book of the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment. Cox and Stowell point out that hair powder is not to be used interchangeably with edible flour. If flour was used, they write, it was only by the very poor, and even then on rare occasion. Meanwhile, Colonel James Chambers of the 1st Pennsylvania recorded on December 8, 1778, that, quote, the quartermaster will draw flour for the men to clean their jackets and breeches and to powder their hair. A subtle but poignant acknowledgement that Continental soldiers' conditions, particularly toward the end of the war, were often equivalent to society's most indigent. Nonetheless, the evidence is significant that soldiers were still expected, and in many cases still wanted, to maintain their personal toilette. The abundance of bone combs unearthed at former encampment sites stands in testament to this. So, too, does the preponderance of travel shaving kits, including this one currently in the collections of Mount Vernon, belonging to General George Washington himself. On that note, before we wrap up on this muggy afternoon, let us briefly address the question of shaving. If you spend any time at all on 18th century reenactor forums, you will note that facial hair is by far the most vociferously discussed topic, usually by reenactors desperately trying to justify their 6-inch beards. While it is impossible to paint every individual of a certain time and place with the same brush, we can indeed take note of broad cultural trends. And in 18th century New England, beards were not among them. While the 17th and 19th centuries are both associated with distinctive facial hair fashions, the ideal 18th century English, or New English man, was in fact beardless. Acclaimed medical historian Dr. Alan Withy, in his comprehensive dissertation, Do Beards Matter? Facial Hair, Health, and Hygiene in Britain, circa 1700 to 1918, writes that, quote, for Tudor men, beards were a symbol of sexual maturity and prowess. Throughout the early modern period, debates also raged about the place of facial hair within the medical framework of the humors. The 18th century, by contrast, saw beards as unrefined and uncouth. Clean-shaven faces reflected enlightened values of neatness and elegance, and razors were linked to new technologies. Uncouth is perhaps an understatement. Withy himself alludes to New England Protestant culture's strong prescriptions against facial hair in another article from 2019. He writes that, quote, Puritan polemicist William Prynne referred to the fact that hair was, in medical terms, regarded as a type of excrement, a waste product of the body caused by inner heat rising up and breaking out on the surface of the skin, much like soot up a chimney. This framing, though foreign to us today, does put into perspective the vehemence with which some 18th century writers condemned beards. You would too, if your cultural context viewed them as literal excrement. This condemnation is strengthened still by the intertwining of moral and physical concerns. It's been said so often as to smack of cliché, but cleanliness in the 18th century zeitgeist truly was next to godliness. Now, overall, the nuanced and sometimes conflicting attitudes to hygiene at the dawn of the American Revolution illuminate several broad themes of life in this fractious time. The tension between Enlightenment values and their predecessors, the balance of group cohesion and individual expression, the rapid emergence of new technologies and the continual reliance on the old. I can imagine few more edifying lenses into a particular society than its attitudes toward cleanliness. It is, after all, one of the few human universals. So thank you very much, and I will now open the floor to any questions. Thank you. Thank you. Question, yes?
So why did, given the apparent superiority of linen, why did cotton replace linen?
Oh, so that is a great question, and it is largely an economic one. So just briefly, because I really could talk about this in a whole other lecture. Briefly, the invention of the cotton gin at the very end of the 18th century, some people do consider that the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it did set off quite a chain of systemic effects. And that led to cotton being much more easier to process at scale, whereas previously it was a small batch crop only, and it grows particularly well in those states that at the time relied on enslaved labor, so the profit margins were very high. So you would see these largely economic factors and cotton taking rapid precedence within a generation or two over linen. And there have been many other factors since then, but that is really the beginning of where we see cotton starting to eclipse linen. And we still see this today. And I often think about my 18th century counterpart who would be amazed to hear that you can buy cotton in any store and linen is something you have to go out of your way to find, because that would have been really the complete opposite for their life experience.
And even today, like the linen shirt is more expensive than a cotton shirt.
Exactly, yes, exactly. Yes?
Was there any brief comeback of linen during the Civil War when cotton wasn't coming out from the South?
So that is a good question, and I don't know too much about the economics of that time. I can make an educated guess that possibly, so the linen trade had never quite gone out of fashion. It was still prevalent prevalent to a smaller scale. But I actually don't know the more educated answer to that question. So if anyone knows more than I do about Civil War era economics, you're welcome to throw your hat in the ring for that. Oh, well, next time.
I'll Google it.
Oh, yes. Yes.
No, but, typhus was carried by lice, and that was particularly bad during the Civil War. So I'm assuming
Yes.
they were not using linen, they were probably primarily using cotton.
Yes, they could have been, although
Wool
Wool too. Well, wool in this context, wool has always been used. And wool, even in the 18th century, was very common. You'll see a lot of wool, including on the regimental coats of the men in our regiment. You see breeches, waistcoats. But the interior layer would always have been linen or cotton in the 19th century. So even when you have wool, it still isn't directly touching your body. But to your question, the typhus, unfortunately, in this time period, that was prevalent as well. And it really does describe quite an uphill battle, reading the primary sources, that these were the efforts that they would attempt day in and day out to stay clean and healthy. But as you can see from just one day of training, you can see how filthy people get. The sleeping conditions as well makes a big difference. The number of men crowded into a room, things like that. So the things we can do are sort of a drop in the bucket at times, but they are still worth pursuing. Yes?
So just an observation, when you showed the white shirt that the gentlemen wear and then they tuck it in
Yes.
and everything, the first thing that came to my mind was Pride and Prejudice, where Colin Firth goes into the water and then he comes out and Elizabeth sees him, and I never thought it was such a,
what's going on?
I knew that it, like, everybody was like a Twitter about the whole
This
thing.
one.
But now that I know that she was a single woman seeing a man in his underwear, it was wet and clean.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, no, that's exactly right.
It's shocking in the movie. It's shocking.
No, that's exactly right. And from a modern perspective, you might think of him as wearing a Speedo instead, for the cultural context that would have occupied. No, that's exactly right.
Also, from personal experience, somehow it's worse to have a wet chemise on if you're to go in the water than to actually have your clothes off. I don't know why exactly.
No,
but
it makes sense. Yeah.
It just, I don't know, it just.
Scandalous.
It is more scandalous, I don't know, it's just.
Well, it
it's
has.
like wet chemise contests are a thing and just, we'll just leave it there.
Yes.
Guys use the Winooski River all weekend?
Oh, yeah.
No.
Not quite. Yes.
So I was curious about the trading routes that might have been possible for the Fuller's Earth.
Yes.
Are there other products for hygiene and health that were sometimes traded?
Yes, certainly. So the Fuller's Earth, that is, I don't know in particular any established routes for that. That is just sort of my conjecture, given that this is a product widely available in England and then the close relationship with New England. But yes, pomade and powder were often on these trade routes, and there was a brisk pomade and a brisk powder industry in particular in England at this time. And as well, razors. So Sheffield, England, is particularly known at this time for razors. And in my primary sources, I kept coming up over and over with archaeological finds of razors at American encampments. They are almost all have a maker's mark from Sheffield, England. So that was really the razor capital of the world at that time. Yes?
So, maybe I missed it and you already spoke to it, but the powder, is that made from talc?
So that is made from a variety of things, and in England at this time it is made from sort of the more damaged or byproduct wheat kernels, and that is just repeatedly boiled until it becomes sort of like a cornstarch consistency. And so it is not to be used interchangeably with edible flour, but then even though it does come from a similar process as creating the edible flour.
Abby Cox's video on YouTube, which you referred to, is really entertaining and really goes into that in depth.
Yes, and she was a reenactor for several years at Colonial Williamsburg, and she talks about the historical hygiene practices that she followed in her time there. So it's very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yes.
I was particularly interested in the fact that they did not want them to defecate except in certain areas. So did they have an
Yes.
understanding of fecal contamination of water and dysentery?
They did, yes, and I am not exactly sure what terms they would have put this understanding in prior to germ theory, but they did nonetheless understand this, and the Mount Independence Orderly Book that I referred to, they do talk in more detail about setting up the latrines in a way that is not upstream of any water sources. And so the 20 lashes on the bare back seems harsh, but it really, the context is you are endangering every person in this regiment. Yes?
You got me thinking, how do they stay hydrated? Were they drinking the water?
So that is, actually, do any of you want to speak to that? And as to, or rather, do you want to speak to your hydration requirements throughout the day, or just things like that, how it feels? Lots.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hydration is incredibly necessary. One of the things that we
Yeah,
check,
stand up.
okay.
Come on.
One of the things that we check every time before we go out is we check that people have water. There are several times while we are in an engagement where where corporals will order their privates to take water to make sure that everybody is hydrated.
Yes, and this is a
So
corroborated order as well.
Yesterday we did 3 engagements, and I had 3 full canteens, 1 for each engagement, and I pretty much finished off my canteen each time.
And as to that, when fresh water was difficult to come by, you would often see the daily rum ration being poured into the canteen to disinfect it. So the mixing of rum and vinegar as well. So switchel is sort of an 18th century hydration drink, which is vinegar and honey. Or vinegar and honey, and just different combinations of apple juice, apple cider, different ratios. But the vinegar is a disinfectant both for the container that it's in and for the mouth and throat as well. So that's going to help if the water you're drinking is not pure.
Also the electrolytes that you get from the switchel.
Yes, absolutely. It really does perk you up in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you don't have a canteen, you do not go out in the field, and one of the, in terms of like emergencies, things like that, the overwhelming majority is people not drinking enough, especially. And it's not always in hot weather, too. It sneaks up on you sometimes. So sometimes we seem a little hyper-vigilant about, like, when did you last drink? But I actually was in a camp that actually had the necklace of shame, that if you were caught not drinking enough water, you wore the necklace, and the only proper response was if somebody asked if you had drank water, it had to be, I just finished something, otherwise you had to drink the water. And until somebody else earned a necklace of shame, then you got to pass it off. But it was a fun thing, but it's actually surprisingly, we need a lot more water than you would necessarily.
Oh, yes.
It's not
Oh, yes.
just people out in the field.
Oh, yes. And to that end, you do sometimes see orders to take the field in shirt sleeves, which is not, even though it is technically indecent, it is better than someone passing out. So, oh, yeah, sorry, you were going to say? And then I did have a question over there after. I'm not ignoring you, but just as soon as he...
I was going to say that also, like, I have seen people go and take ambulance rides to the hospital for dehydration. It is not uncommon.
No. Oh, yeah. Yeah. All right, question, yes, sir.
Oh,
Yes.
Wondering if we're talking about purity of water, is beer ever used as a way of purifying water?
Yes, this time. So beer, small beer in particular, which is a beer with a very low alcohol content. And so this is not getting you drunk, but this is just essentially almost the purified form of water. So you see this being drunk quite a bit. Although later in the war, you see a lot of supply chain issues popping up, and that does, one can imagine that does increase the incidence of waterborne illnesses as well.
Skye, we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, sure, yes.
This is a little bit off.
Sure, yeah.
The side of this discussion, but if you go across the lake to Willsboro, there's an old museum over there.
Yeah.
And the guy who had the museum was telling me that when Burgoyne came down with his men on his way to Saratoga, they brought typhoid to.
Okay.
And there's actually a graveyard on the Willsboro side that's mostly children apparently who died as they camped on their way south.
Really?
So I have a question about if the Continental Army was clean, or they had.
Well, they tried, yeah.
Have the same standards, or was there a problem with this mingling of?
So that's a very good question. So some of the sources that I've cited here actually do come from British orderly books specifically. So they do have the same standards, and these standards are actually remarkably uniform across cultures. One of the sources, there was a German source I cited here and a French one as well. So you do have a lot of the same observations being made about hygiene. But just as I had mentioned earlier, these efforts, they are sort of pushing uphill against some of the inevitabilities caused by the conditions of campaign. So some men are going to get sick, and there are going to be outbreaks, but these methods are not preventing it, but just doing what you can to minimize it as much as you can. Yeah, you're welcome. All right, one more. Anyone? Okay, yeah, sure.
So my knowledge of the Continental Army is pretty much limited to the fact that I lived a couple miles down the street in New Jersey, from where the Continental Army overwintered 2 different winters.
Oh, okay.
In New Jersey in the Watchung Mountains.
Okay.
So this is winter.
Yes.
They're building huts, and my knowledge is mainly, well, what the information I got there. But they're like one step up from camping out in the winter. They're
Yes.
huts, they're crammed together. Okay, so, and I don't know about the officers, some of them actually stayed in houses.
Yeah, the Third Amendment did not exist yet.
Right, so, the men don't have enough clothes to keep warm, don't have enough wood to keep the huts warm, don't have enough food, they're starving, disease is prevalent, they're dying, they're not fighting, they're just trying to survive the winter, because the English are probably overwintering in like New York City or Staten Island or wherever they are. So the Continental Army, they're starving to death. They're desperate, they're just trying to stay alive. So that's my impression of it. This seems like a luxury. This seems like warm weather, bathing, soap. If they didn't have food, would they have soap? You know, were there different times where the Continental Army was doing really well and men could actually be able to conform to these standards, and other times when this would be just a complete luxury?
Oh, absolutely. And just from what you've mentioned, there were indeed conditions that were very harsh. And I did allude here to, particularly at the end of the war, you will see a lot of the instructions in the orderly books that will say standards upheld when able, or to the best of your ability. So this is outlining the gold standard, and the degree to which it was maintained in different times and places was certainly variable, as you say. But really, I included the standards just to illustrate that hygiene was far more important. And its importance was understood far more than I think a lot of people do realize today.
Skye, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.